Welcome to the World Revolution News. My name is Thomas Jefferson and today is September 2nd, 2011. Today's episode is on the ongoing protest in Chile that began earlier this year and has recently gathered more energy. Here is Emily Pankhurst with more details.
Thank you, and welcome everyone from around the world. In countries around the globe, students have become increasingly active participants in protests against governments, as recent events in Europe have shown. The 2011 student protests are worldwide, and recently spread to Chile, which began gradually in May, and can even be traced back 5 years to the so-called Penguin Revolution, or the 2006 student protests. The recent student protests began on the backs of other national protests, such as the Hydroizane Dam project, and gas prices in Magallanes province. Even though US-backed Pinochet has been removed for some time, he created a system of private universities and voucher-type subsidies for private schools. Today, low-income Chileans generally go to public schools, or voucher schools and end up in expensive, often low-performing private universities. Before his rule, education was free. Now, according to the OECD, college costs in Chile are among the world's highest. Chilean economist Marcel Claude has found that student debt is close to 174% of Chilean students' annual salary upon graduation, with over 50% among them heavily in debt. The average Chilean university student graduates with $45,000 in debt, a larger burden than the US, where the comparable figure is about $27,000. Currently in Chile, only 45% of high school students study in traditional public schools, and most universities are also private. No new public universities have been built since the end of the Pinochet era, even though the number of university students have swelled. The protests began in part by the initiative of the Minister of Education, Joaquin Lavín, who sought to increase government funding of non-traditional universities. Although officially non-profit, some of these institutions were known to use legal loopholes to turn profits. Lavín had invested in several firms that render services to a private Chilean university. On the other side, when student protests gradually started in mid-2011, Camila Dowling, 23 years old, and unknown until a few months ago, recently became the second female leader in the 105-year history of the University of Chile Student Union. She quickly became their face and voice, and has led popular protests. Encacerolazos, which is a kind of popular protest during which participants bang pots and pans. The student leader said that the government's strategy of repressing violence by the students only aggravated the situation even worse, which led to a dialogue stoppage, and in turn worsening the political climate in the country. Students' demonstrations slammed the popularity of the government of Chilean billionaire Sebastián Piñera, whose favorability rating fell to 26%. Chilean police listed on June 13 that 50 schools were occupied by protesters. The protesters put the number at 100. As a response to student demands, President Piñera said that the government would improve education financing by cutting interest rates on student loans from 6.4% to 2%. But the government promises did little to control the uprising. Then on June 30, there was a massive demonstration that mobilized between 100 to 200,000 demonstrators. In response, on July 5, Chilean President Sebastián Piñera announced in a televised speech some outlines for educational reforms, which would cost around $4 billion. Last week, it spread beyond the school, and the Workers' United Center of Chile organized a nationwide 2-day protest. During the strike, 4 separate marches took place in Santiago, as well as additional protests across the country. According to union officials, a total of about 600,000 people were involved in protests. 750 people were arrested, with 6 police officers wounded in Santiago, where protesters constructed roadblocks, then damaged some cars and buildings. Several dozen were reported injured. Then, police forces used tear gas and water cannons on protesters at the end of the demonstrations. Earlier, some protesters had thrown stones and started fires. 16-year-old Manuel Gutierrez Reynoso, later died from gunshot wounds to the chest. Witnesses claimed that he was shot by a police officer. The majority of Chileans, between 70 and 80%, support the student movement, which has been energized by last week's 48-hour nationwide strike. One protester summed it up this way: Chile spends its money making weapons and strengthening the army for a war that never arrives, said Daniela Moda, an architecture student at the University of Chile. She went on to add, Chile also gives away its resources to other countries. It says, the copper, come and get it. With the copper, we could subsidize the education for all. End quote. If Camilla and her colleagues have their way, then these actions are posing a serious challenge to the government, and attempting a significant overhaul of the country's education system. Whether it stops there is yet to be determined. Camilla went on to say, there are huge levels of discontent. It is always the youth that make the first move. We don't have family commitments. This allows us to be freer. We took the first step, but we are no longer alone. The older generations are now joining this fight. End quote. With major revolutions on 5 continents, one has to wonder how long before the entire planet is revolting. And for what reasons?
I'll tell you one reason. That's the United Banking Cartel. 'Cause it's the United Banking Cartel versus us, and not me versus you, for we are the many, and they are the few.
Have a good weekend, everyone.